Hello and welcome to Civics Forward from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. My name is Mike Carney. I lead the Emerging Issues program at the Chamber Foundation, and I'm delighted to be your host this afternoon. Today, we're going to be joined by two experts in national security, Suzanne Spaulding and Elizabeth Parker. They're going to talk to us about their perspective on civics in America, why it's so important to the country, and what it's going to take to get our democracy into strong fighting shape. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth and Suzanne to the stage, or the virtual stage, I guess we should call it.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, thanks for joining us. Mike. So, Elizabeth, you were the top lawyer at CIA and the National Security Agency, among other stops in your career. Suzanne, you were an undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security. How is it that two national security experts end up talking about civics?
You want to go first, Suzanne? Yeah.
Sure. Mike, first of all, thank you so much for not just for having Elizabeth and I on today to talk with you, but for the work that you and the Chamber Foundation are doing to promote the need for civics education and this series of Civics Forward. So thank you very much. I came to this through the work that I have been doing at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I am leading the Defending Democratic Institutions project. And we started in 2017 when I got out of Department of Homeland Security, having spent much of 2016 focused on trying to secure our elections and realizing that the important role that information operations played in our adversaries' efforts to undermine public trust in elections. And mindful that what we saw in the elections was really just part of a broader campaign, in this case by Russia, to undermine public confidence in democracy writ large and in our democratic institutions. Picking up on weaknesses of our own making, amplifying domestic voices, and setting a pattern that other countries could follow. So we started doing a deep dive on information operations targeting our democratic institutions and public faith and confidence in democracy. We did a deep dive on public trust and confidence in the justice system and how, again, Russia in particular was targeting that public faith and confidence. At the end, we came up with a report called Beyond the Ballot that details the evidence of information operations targeting public faith and confidence in our justice system as irrevocably broken, not just flawed and needing change. And one of the things we realized was that one of the most important ways you could combat disinformation targeting faith in democracy is to build public resilience against the content of that messaging. And the best way to build that public resilience is to reinvigorate civics education in this country. And that's why we think it's so important that civics education be understood as a national security imperative. Putin knows how important an engaged and informed citizenry is to our democracy, that if he can undermine public faith and confidence in the core strength of our democracy, which is its capacity to change, that he can weaken us. And we need to recognize that as well.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, so I guess my journey is a little bit more circuitous and a little bit longer than the one that Suzanne has just described in coming to the realization that our decline in civic education is really a national security threat. After I left the intelligence community world, I spent about more than a decade in academia. In particular, for 10 years, I was the dean of a law school. And during that period, some interesting things happened that gave me some kind of clues, I guess, to a sense that maybe all was not well with civic education. For me, the most memorable, there were two memorable moments. One was when living in California at the time, I was part of a group that then Chief Justice Ron George created to support an impartial, as he called it, judiciary. And at the very first meeting, he said, the reason for naming his commission an impartial judiciary was that surveys showed that the public didn't understand what an independent judiciary meant. They thought that meant a runaway judiciary. They'd lost apparently any sense of the three branches of government and the idea that each one is independent. That stuck with me. And later on, when I got involved in some K-12 education, I was stunned when I heard one of the most well-positioned people at the Irvine Foundation, an educational policy leader, say, well, I don't think there's a gold standard curriculum for teaching what you think should be taught, which was really a law-themed based educational approach. But she said, if there were, we don't have the teachers to deliver it. And I thought, well, what does she mean by that? Those little thoughts were kind of, what shall we say, reverberating when Suzanne and I started getting involved in looking at how we could really shore up our judiciary, because we were worried that it was the subject, as Suzanne has so well described, potential attacks from particularly Russia. And one of the things we did in that effort was to say, well, we've got to build ways to respond to these attacks. And, we looked, of course, immediately at engaging the bench and the bar in doing a better job of educating the public. But another thing we did was to say, well, let's look at what kind of do an environmental survey as to how strong is our sense of civics and our understanding as a population about the democracy, which should be so important to us. And the survey results were chilling. I'll share just a couple of statistics. I think you'll get the point. We found that 35% of millennials reported losing faith in American democracy, and just 25% were confident about the democratic system. We found that in the 2018 National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is essentially the nation's report card on civic education, that less than 24% of eighth graders could reach a competent level in their understanding. Well, the statistics go on, and they're pretty much consistent with what I've just shared. And it really kind of, shall we say, caught me, I think all of us, by surprise that there has been an incredible loss in not just understanding, but commitment to our democratic systems. Well, it isn't something, as most recently, I think former President Obama mentioned, but certainly Sandra Day O'Connor has been another great advocate for this problem and solving it. If we don't understand and continually replenish our understanding of democratic structures and systems, we'll lose it. This is not something that just naturally flows to us through the gene pool. And combining that loss in understanding and commitment to democratic structures with the attacks that we now see are coming from outside our nation really was what brought us to the realization that returning attention to civic education is not just nice, it's a national security imperative. And let me add a couple of other just thoughts for the audience, which may be interesting. This decline that I speak of results, I think, almost directly from a lack of attention to civics. And here again, we have statistics that will shore up that comment. Among them, that we spend something like 54 cents per student on civics and history as compared to $54 at the national level. And that, again, looking at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the support for civics has declined dramatically, in part from the well-intentioned focus that we've been increasingly making on STEM topics, but we've done that at the expense of civics. And so things we don't teach, and here we get back to the comment about teachers, we also don't require teachers to understand and be prepared for, and essentially then the results are predictable. So this is, I think, in not necessarily a nutshell, but the story of my own coming to a realization that there's a new kind of national security threat. It's right here at home, and an internal lack of appreciation for our government and our constitutional structures and system.
So Suzanne, Elizabeth just said something I want to kind of dig into a little. if you were looking at another country and you saw the data that she just cited about the levels of knowledge, the levels of commitment to our political system, what would you think, or what would you say about that country? And it's, what does it say about the vulnerability of the country or the strength of the country, both in terms of its, place on the world stage, but then also, I guess, economic power as well?
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike, because it is one of the things that is really important to understand is that democracy can be very resilient, but it is also, in a way, very fragile because it is so dependent upon an informed and engaged citizenry, because it is, in fact, a form of governance that is of, by, and for the people. And if the people are not informed to be active and engaged participants in that governance, in that social contract, in that democracy, then that democracy will decline. And we have seen this in countries. We've seen democracy retreat. We saw great advances in democracy over many years, and then we've seen what it looked to be, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe, but all over the world, emerging democracies that have then fallen into decline. And it should be a reminder to us that democracy must be fought for. And one of the things that is so troubling, in addition to the declining trust in institutions, is the increased division within our country. And again, I think this is something our adversaries see and exploit. We know this. We know that a lot of the information operations coming from our adversaries in particular are designed to exacerbate those divisions. And that makes it harder for the country to mobilize to meet the challenges that we need to meet at home and abroad. So you talk about how does the kind of statistics that Elizabeth cited and a decline in civic understanding impact a country's place on the world stage. I think very much so. If we are not able to mobilize to protect to do what we need to do to advance our interests and protect our interests around the world, that we are not able to hold, if we are not able to hold our democracy up as a shining example, if we are not able to combat the kind of disinformation that wants to tell the world that our democracy is just as corrupt and broken as Russia's form of governance, then we are going to have a very hard time competing around the world. And again, Putin knows this, which is one of the reasons that he pushes so hard this narrative. And we need to be engaged, every one of us. We need to be empowered to be agents of change so that we can hold our institutions accountable for living up to our aspirations, so that we can believe in them and have a sense of trust that's born not of complacency and assumptions that our institutions will do what we want them to do, but is based on our understanding of how to hold them accountable and how to know if they are living up to our trust and how to make them change if that's what needs to happen. And that's what our civics education should be aimed at. Not just we love democracy, but we love democracy because it is capable of change, because it is so aspirational.
So, Elizabeth, you're a lawyer. Suzanne is a lawyer. A lot of the people we talk to in the civics world have a background in the law. A lot of the organizations that are most active in promoting civics are associated in one way. You mentioned some programming associated with the courts. What do you say to people who look at this and say and think, well, if I'm in school and I'm not going to go to law school, or I'm not going to be pre-law, or I'm not going to college, this doesn't really matter to me, why does this matter to everyone? Because it seems to be very legally driven, but should it be that way? Well,
maybe a little story here. One of the things that I became actively engaged in was to try to create a law-themed high school. I think I mentioned that. And I thought, well, this will be a way to increase in particular, the diversity in the legal population, which is actually one of the very worst among our professions. Well, I was an abject failure in creating more lawyers, but what I did do was to create some wonderful citizens, and I think that may have been a better result. And I learned from those high school students how they came to understand and appreciate what understanding their constitutional roles, their rights, responsibilities could do for them. And it was stunning to me that in this very much lower income, highly diverse school, they had something like one fight in an entire year, no security. They understood how to resolve differences, how to deal with different opinions, how to work through to effective solutions. They were a microcosm of what I would wish for the entire nation. And, you know, we look at some of the issues that have been top of mind for many people, and I think you can sense a frustration. They really don't know how to engage the government that should be serving them and how to make useful and meaningful changes. And so I think this is a part of it too. I think it underscores what the values need to be to improve civic discourse generally. And it's a vehicle, a teaching vehicle, a learning vehicle that allows us to come together, even though we have great differences perhaps in our policy choices. Suzanne led a conversation with Justices Gorsuch and Sotomayor some weeks ago, which is on the CSIS website still. And it was really very touching to hear them say to one another, you know, we don't agree on a large number of policy choices, but here's something we do agree on. We need to come together and appreciate the common value system that supports this nation, and it's grounded in civics. And so, yes, I certainly would say that law schools and lawyers have a role in this. I used to say to my incoming students, you really are the protectors of the culture that should knit us all together in our remarkable diversity. But that culture, I think, is based on a good understanding of civic education.
So following up on that, when do you think we started losing the ability to have that civil discourse among people who disagree?
Suzanne, you want to go first, or should I take a stab at it?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I think it goes back, perhaps ironically, to our response to Sputnik in 1959, where we suddenly said, okay, it's really very important that we have much more attention on STEM topics. And as I mentioned earlier, that had an unintended negative consequence, as well as some positive, certainly, where we stopped teaching about the systems and structures of our government. We stopped demonstrating how these things work. And so we lost, I think, critical abilities as the decades proceeded to really have the kind of conversation that is so important to advancing our nation. And that polarization, I think, has been exacerbated by not just foreign actors, but frankly, there have been some I think steps taken domestically that don't look towards bringing us together, but rather to taking advantage of separating us and creating this kind of a fighting interaction rather than a conversation and a thoughtfulness in terms of how we address and understand our policy differences. And this will be key as we go forward. This is a nation that will always be very, very diverse, not just ethnically and racially, but geographically, in any number of ways. And in order to knit those kinds of differences together so that we can talk with one another and understand one another, we need to have a forum for these types of conversations. And that forum ought to begin, I think, in the K through 12 space. But it shouldn't end there. It needs to go forward beyond that. And frankly, I will say that the judges have been, I think, leaders in trying to create some sort of educational outreach, really not just to K through 12 communities, but to adults as well, because I think they're on the front line of seeing how poorly understood our structures and system of democracy is and how critical that is to the work that they do. But it's not just them, it's critical really to everything that we do as a nation. We've got to be able to identify differences, to talk through them, and then importantly, come to compromise. It's not a winner take all strategy that's going to ultimately, I think, make our democracy successful.
That's a great segue into a question that we've got from the audience. And I'll throw this to Suzanne. How can we address civic ignorance on a national scale if it is seen to serve partisan goals in the short term?
Yeah, it is one of the challenges that we see, and we see it playing out now, even in the context of support for civics education itself, which seems to be, such a really motherhood and apple pie, if you will, kind of issue. And in fact, has federal support for civics education has garnered bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, with legislation that's been introduced with Republican and Democratic sponsors. But even there, you begin to see the polarization and the partisanship start to chip away in the support for reinvigorating civics education all across this country. And we can't let that happen. We've got to recognize that this is fundamentally really about reminding ourselves of our shared values, right? Civics is one of, as Elizabeth just beautifully articulated, is one of the ways that we're one of our only hopes for getting past the incredible divisions within our country now. There was a wonderful experiment done years ago where they brought together a very diverse group of people and put them all in a room, and very different views on politics and backgrounds, et cetera. And they started calling out, okay, everyone who likes mustard on their hot dogs, go stand over here. Everyone whose favorite sport is basketball, go stand over here. And they began to sort of put these folks in groups around things that they had in common. And as they spoke to each other and realized that they voted for different people in the election, that they had very different backgrounds, they were able to have conversations that they could never otherwise have, because they knew they had at least one thing in common. Fundamentally, civics is about reminding us of our shared values. And I think that is one of the ways in which we have to rise above the partisanship to promote civics so that it can help us to have this civil discourse that we need to reach compromise or to move forward in the ways that a democracy depends upon.
So Elizabeth, we have another question I'll throw to you from the audience. We've seen a lot of evidence, or we've seen some evidence, I should say, of what appears to be rising support for socialism among young people. Do you think this is in part due to a lack of understanding of how our democracy works? And I'll add on to that, what do you see as the relationship between our political and economic systems? And why is it, why is it important you understand both?
Well, that's a compound question, as we lawyers like to say. Let me first talk about the apparent appeal of socialism, or maybe I would make it not just socialism, but an autocratic structure. And you do see that people saying, well, I'm not in support. I mean, these surveys would tell you, not understanding democracy and saying that it's not necessarily the best way to govern our country. Well, why might they say that? Well, they're frustrated perhaps because they don't understand what some of the process that our democratic structure creates involves. I think there's a frustration. I would say that many of the marches that we've seen over the last several years are also an example of people really don't know how to engage the system. It seems to them that there's no system that they can engage. Why? Because they've not been prepared to really engage the leadership and to bring their issues into focus. Suzanne mentioned compromise. I think that's critical. I think one of the things we learn in civic education is to stand in another person's shoes, to understand what their perspective is, and then to work through these kinds of issues. As to the connection between civic education and business, well, my hat is off to the Chamber for the 2019 report. I think it was called The Business Case for Civic Education. Quite right. I mean, our country is a rich, vibrant economic space because of the democratic structures that have supported it. Do we really want to see us devolve into some sort of an autocratic system where this type of diversity in all parts of our civic life are diminished? No, that's a way to undercut the entrepreneurial energy, the innovative ability of this country. So yes, there is definitely a connection, I think, between civics and a robust economic structure, and the two have got to go hand in hand.
We would not disagree with that. So Suzanne, I'm looking at a Wall Street Journal piece from today that talks about a Pew Research Center report, and they surveyed 16,000 people from 16 advanced economies, and many of which are strong U.S. allies. And I'll read from the journal. In 14 of the 16 nations surveyed, majorities of respondents said democracy in the U.S. used to be a good example, but hasn't been in recent years. And that sentiment was nearly a majority opinion in Italy and Greece, the only countries where it fell just below 50%. So as you look at our place, going back to something we talked about earlier, when you look at our place in the world, why is it so important to America's foreign policy interests and to its national security that not only do we have a strong, robust civics program in this country, but that also our democracy is seen as strong and reliable by its partners?
Yeah, and that it is seen as responsive. I think picking up on Elizabeth's comments in your earlier question about young people's, not thinking that democracy is particularly the right governance structure. I do think a couple things I would add to that. I do think that young people often equate democracy with unbridled capitalism. And so linking in that way the economic structure and our governance structure. But I do think it comes down often to that they don't see our democracy as serving them, which is what it's supposed to do. I'm not saying that they're wrong. Often they're right. Often our institutions do fail us, and there is a lack of equity in this country without question. And our justice system does have flaws that need to be reformed. The important difference, the reason that shouldn't lead to a decline in support for democracy, is that we do have the capacity to change. And I think that is such an important lesson. And what young people, I think, don't appreciate, and not just young people, but a lot of people don't appreciate, is that is the distinguishing characteristic, really the most important to my mind, between democracy and totalitarian regimes, is that ability to change. But it's not going to change, and our institutions aren't going to live up to our aspirations unless we make them. So I think the protests in the streets are a sign of patriotism. I think peaceful protesters have not given up hope. They are trying to bring about change. And what we need to do for all of us across the country is to understand all the ways in which we can bring about, through constitutional means, the changes we want to see in our government. And if you don't have an understanding of how that government is set up, what those institutions are there for, how they are supposed to perform, what are the accountability mechanisms in place, and what is your role, what are the levers that you have, then you will never feel empowered to bring about change, and you will give up on democracy. And we won't be that shining city on the hill. We won't be the example for people all around the world of a system of governance that is responsive to its people.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on than what you just said, Suzanne. Suzanne, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks for the work that you're doing to move civics up the list of national security priorities. We've been watching it very closely and really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. There will be one of these Civics Forward events every month. We hope you'll come back. We hope that you find it a good 30 minutes where you can think about how we can all work together to create the environment in which people feel our democracy is resilient and they have the knowledge, the skills, and the sense of agency to be full participants in our democracy. You can learn more about our work at uschamberfoundation.org. In the meantime, thank you again for joining us and be well.